Snow had come early to the village of Hollybrook, arriving not with drama, but with the patient certainty of a well-bred guest who knew she would be welcome. By Christmas Eve every hedge wore a white trimming, the stone cottages crouched beneath soft caps of frost, and the narrow lane leading to Greystone Manor lay hushed, as though the countryside itself were holding its breath for the holy night. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a sensible tweed coat and a woollen scarf she had knitted herself several winters earlier, paused at the wrought-iron gate and surveyed the scene with mild approval. Snow, she thought, had a way of making things appear peaceful, even when they were not. Greystone Manor rose ahead, an austere yet handsome building of grey stone, its windows glowing warmly against the early dusk. Evergreen wreaths hung at measured intervals, and a single lantern burned beside the great oak door. Somewhere inside, a piano played a hesitant carol, each note drifting faintly through the cold air. Miss Marple smiled. A house full of people at Christmas, she reflected, was very much like a village fete, plenty of goodwill on the surface, and quite enough opportunity beneath for old grievances to resurface. She was here at the invitation of Colonel Reginald Ashcombe, a retired officer whose health had begun to concern his friends, and whose niece had thought it a kindness to surround him with company for the season. Miss Marple had known the Colonel years before, through distant relations and nearer acquaintances, and when his letter arrived, written in a hand a little shakier than she remembered, she had felt it only proper to accept. Inside, the air was warm with coal fire and the comforting mingled sense of pine, polish, and baking. A large Christmas tree dominated the entrance hall, its branches heavy with glass ornaments and carefully placed candles. Holly boughs adorned the banisters, and beneath the tree lay a modest arrangement of parcels tied with ribbon. Miss Marple came a brisk voice. A woman in her early 40s approached, her expression bright, but her eyes alert in a manner Miss Marple immediately noted. Elena Ashcombe, the Colonel's niece and current mistress of Greystone Manor, extended her hand. "We are so very glad you could come. Uncle Reginald speaks of you often usually when he wishes to win an argument." Miss Marple laughed softly. "I find that gentlemen of a certain age have an excellent memory for occasions when they were contradicted." Elena smiled, though it did not quite reach her eyes. "You must be frozen. Do come in properly. Tea will be served in the drawing-room." The drawing-room was already well populated. Miss Marple took in the group with the practised ease of one accustomed to village committees and parish councils, where the ability to observe quietly was often the difference between understanding and confusion. By the fire stood Arthur Bell, Greystone's long, serving solicitor, a tall, spare man with thinning hair and an expression of habitual reserve. He held his teacup as though it were a legal document, carefully and with faint suspicion. On a chaise near the window sat Lydia Ashcombe, the Colonel's second wife, some 20 years his junior. She wore a deep green velvet dress, and watched the room with eyes that seemed perpetually calculating, though she greeted Miss Marple with warm politeness. Nearby, arranging flowers with unnecessary precision, was Dr. Harold Finch, the village physician. His spectacles perched precariously on his nose, and he spoke in a voice carefully modulated, as though always aware of the weight of his words. Lastly, half hidden behind a stack of books and newspapers, was Margaret Bell, Arthur's sister and the manor's temporary guest. She was a pale woman with a nervous manner, prone to starting at sudden sounds and offering smiles that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. And presiding over them all, seated in a high, backed chair near the fire, was Colonel Reginald Ashcombe himself. He looked smaller than Miss Marple remembered, though his eyes were still keen, and his moustache, though now mostly grey, retained its military stiffness. "Jane," he exclaimed, "I told Elena you'd bring sense with you, if nothing else." Miss Marple approached him warmly. "Sense is a dangerous thing to promise, Colonel. One never knows when it may fail one entirely." He chuckled, but there was a tightness about his mouth that did not escape her notice. As tea was poured and polite conversation flowed, Miss Marple listened more than she spoke. She had always found that people revealed themselves most freely when they believed they were merely filling the air. The Colonel complained of the cold, of changes in the village, of doctors who fussed too much. Lydia spoke of Christmas traditions abroad and hinted, just faintly, at the difficulty of maintaining Greystone Manor on its present income. Elena discussed plans for a small carol service to be held in the village church on Christmas morning. Arthur Bell remained largely silent, though when he did speak it was with careful precision. "The Colonel has made certain arrangements," he said at one point, glancing briefly toward his client. "Matters of inheritance, one might say. It is prudent, given his health." A shadow passed across Lydia's face, so fleeting that Miss Marple might have imagined it, had she not been watching closely. "Such gloomy talk for Christmas Eve," Lydia said lightly. "Surely we can all agree to leave wills and documents for another day." The Colonel stirred in his chair. "Nonsense. A man ought to know his affairs are in order, especially when people start counting on them." There was a moment of silence, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Miss Marple sipped her tea and reflected that Christmas had a curious way of sharpening expectations. Later that evening, after a simple supper, the household gathered in the drawing-room once more. Candles were lit, and Dr. Finch read aloud from the Gospel of Luke, his voice steady and reverent. Outside, the snow continued its silent fall. At precisely 10 o'clock, the Colonel announced his intention to retire. "Early start tomorrow," he said. "I intend to be at church, and I won't have anyone saying I slept through Christmas morning." Lydia rose at once. "I'll bring you your night draught." Dr. Finch frowned faintly. "I thought we agreed he would manage without it tonight." "Nonsense," Lydia replied. "It helps him sleep." Miss Marple noticed that Elena looked uncertain, but said nothing. The Colonel drank the draught with only mild complaint, and was assisted upstairs by Elena. The rest of the household dispersed soon after, the quiet settling over Greystone Manor like a held breath. Miss Marple retired to her room, where a small fire burned cheerfully. She sat for a while, knitting, her thoughts wandering back over the evening's conversations. There had been nothing overtly alarming, yet something, she felt, lay just beneath the surface. It reminded me, she thought, of poor Mrs. Hopkins in St. Mary Mead, who smiled so pleasantly right up until the moment she accused her sister of stealing the jam. She slept lightly, and woke once in the night, thinking she heard footsteps in the corridor, but the house soon returned to silence, and she dismissed the sound as nothing more than the settling of old beams. Morning came late, wrapped in pale winter light. It was Elena's scream that shattered the peace. Miss Marple, already awake, opened her door to find the household in motion, voices calling, footsteps rushing toward the Colonel's room. The door stood open. Elena was standing just inside, one hand pressed to her mouth, her face drained of colour. The Colonel lay in bed, his eyes closed, his expression strangely serene. Dr. Finch was at his side within moments, checking for breath, for pulse. He straightened slowly. "I'm afraid," he said quietly, "Colonel Ashcombe is dead." A hush fell over the room, thick and heavy, but "he was perfectly well last night," Lydia whispered. Dr. Finch hesitated. He passed peacefully in his sleep, it seems. Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze resting on the Colonel's bedside table. The empty glass from the night draught stood there, rinsed and neatly placed. Peaceful, perhaps, but Miss Marple had seen too many peaceful endings to take them at face value, and as the snow continued to fall outside Greystone Manor, she felt, with quiet certainty, that Christmas morning in Hollybrook would not bring peace so easily. If you like, next I can. Christmas morning in Hollybrook arrived muffled and subdued, as though the village itself sensed it ought not to celebrate too loudly. The bells of St. Cuthbert's Church rang out across the snow-covered fields, but their sound seemed distant, almost apologetic. At Greystone Manor the household gathered not in festivity, but in quiet shock. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room near the fire, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the others with the attentive patience that years of village life had perfected. Shock, she knew, revealed character more reliably than comfort ever could. Lydia Ashcombe sat rigidly on the sofa, her eyes red, rimmed but dry, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. Elena stood near the window, staring out at the snow with a fixed expression, as though the world beyond the glass might offer answers the room could not. Arthur Bell paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, while Margaret Bell hovered near the doorway, pale and visibly trembling. "Doctor," Finch cleared his throat. "I've telephoned the authorities. He said, given the Colonel's age and condition, it may be considered a natural passing, but procedure must be followed." "Procedure?" Lydia repeated faintly. "On Christmas Day." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Death is quite inconsiderate that way," she said. "It rarely consults the calendar." Lydia looked at her sharply, as though startled by the calm remark, then looked away again. Inspector Thomas Keene arrived shortly after noon, stamping snow from his boots in the entrance hall, and removing his hat with solemn courtesy. He was a man in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by years of country policing rather than city crime. "I'm sorry to intrude on such a day," he said, "but I'll need to ask a few questions." "Of course," Elena replied, recovering herself. "Anything you require." The inspector listened carefully as Doctor Finch explained the circumstances of the Colonel's death, nodding slowly. No sign of struggle. Finch concluded. No outward indication of distress. Inspector Keene's gaze shifted briefly to Miss Marple. "And you are Miss Jane Marple," she said, "a guest." He nodded politely. "Then perhaps you'll forgive me if I begin with the family." He spoke first with Lydia in the morning-room while the others waited. Miss Marple, though not invited, could not help noticing how the voices carried faintly through the thin walls of the old house. "I brought him his draught," Lydia said, her voice wavering, "as I always do." "Prepared by whom?" "Dr. Finch, of course." Inspector Keene made a note. "Did you notice anything unusual?" "No, nothing at all." When Lydia emerged, her composure appeared more fragile than before. Elena went next, answering questions briskly, though Miss Marple observed that her hands shook slightly as she poured herself tea afterward. Arthur Bell's interview lasted longer. When he returned, his face was set, and he avoided looking at anyone. Margaret Bell was last. She emerged tearful and apologetic, murmuring that she hoped she had not said anything foolish. Miss Marple waited until Inspector Keene had finished and was examining the Colonel's room once more before she spoke. "Inspector," she said mildly, "may I ask, will there be a post, mortem?" He hesitated. "Given the circumstances, it may not be deemed necessary." She smiled politely. "I see, though I can't help recalling poor Mr. Henderson in St. Mary Mead. Everyone assumed his passing was peaceful, too. until it turned out his cordial had been most unfriendly. Inspector Keene looked at her with renewed interest. "You suspect foul play?" "I suspect." Miss Marple replied carefully that certainty is often premature. That afternoon the village gathered at the church as planned, though the mood was sombre. The colonel's pew stood empty, a small wreath placed upon it in quiet tribute. Miss Marple sat near the back, observing the villagers as keenly as she listened to the hymns. She noticed whispers exchanged, glances cast toward the Ashcombe family, and the familiar hum of speculation that always followed sudden death. After the service she lingered near the porch, greeting acquaintances. It was there she overheard Mrs. Pelham, the postmistress, murmuring to Mrs. Grant, the baker's wife, "Poor man," Mrs. Pelham said, "though I always thought he looked troubled lately." Troubled how? Oh, worried, as though he'd discovered something unpleasant. Miss Marple stored the remark away carefully. Back at Greystone Manor she found Dr. Finch in his study, carefully washing his hands. "Doctor," she said gently, "may I ask what exactly was in the colonel's night draught?" He stiffened slightly. "A mild sedative, entirely appropriate, and the dosage precisely measured. Of course," Miss Marple said, "one always trusts precision." He looked at her sharply. "Are you suggesting—" "I am suggesting nothing," she interrupted softly. "Merely asking questions." That evening Miss Marple sought out Elena, finding her in the library, staring at a ledger. "You manage the household accounts?" Miss Marple asked. Elena nodded. Uncle Reginald insisted. Lydia never had the head for figures. And were they comfortable? Elena hesitated. "Barely. The manor requires constant repair. Uncle had planned certain changes which others may not have welcomed." Elena met her gaze steadily. "Possibly." Later still, Miss Marple spoke with Arthur Bell, who stood alone in the drawing-room, examining a portrait of the colonel in his military days. He was revising his will. Arthur admitted quietly he intended to alter certain provisions. In whose favour? Arthur's jaw tightened. "That is confidential." Miss Marple nodded. "Naturally." That night, as snow fell once more, Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting slowly. The pieces, she felt, were beginning to arrange themselves, not into clarity, but into possibility. A draft administered without witnesses, a will in flux, a household bound by money, expectation, and quiet resentment, and beneath it all the curious stillness of Christmas Eve, silent enough for a single, deliberate act to pass unnoticed. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. It is never the noise that betrays a crime, she thought. It is the silence afterward. By the third day after Christmas, Hollybrook had fully awakened to the fact that Colonel Ashcombe's death was no longer merely a sorrow. It was a puzzle. Snow still lay thick on the fields, but footprints now crossed it freely, villagers calling at Greystone Manor under the guise of sympathy, curiosity sharpening their condolences. Miss Marple observed it all with the detached familiarity of one who had seen grief turn swiftly into speculation. Inspector Keene remained in the village, having decided, wisely in Miss Marple's opinion, that the colonel's passing deserved closer attention. A preliminary examination of the body had revealed no obvious cause of death beyond cardiac failure, yet something about the circumstances troubled him. Perfectly healthy heart for a man his age, he admitted one afternoon, standing with Miss Marple in the manor's cold conservatory, no warning signs, no distress, and no certainty. Miss Marple added gently. He glanced at her. "You're convinced something was amiss." "I am convinced," she replied, "that people rarely die at precisely the most convenient moment for everyone else without assistance." That morning had brought the first real disturbance. Margaret Bell, pale and shaking, had appeared at breakfast clutching a small bottle. I didn't know what to do. She whispered, "I found it in the waste bin outside Dr. Finch's study." The bottle, Inspector Keen confirmed, had once contained the sedative prescribed to the Colonel. It was empty, and bore traces of a substance not listed on the label. Dr. Finch was summoned at once. His composure faltered as the bottle was produced. "That proves nothing," he said sharply. "Medical refuse. I dispose of such things regularly. And yet—" Inspector Keen said mildly, "This bottle was disposed of on Christmas morning, after the Colonel's death. Miss Marple watched the doctor closely. His hands trembled just slightly. I followed procedure. He insisted." Always, Miss Marple recalled his words precisely measured. Precision, she reflected, could sometimes hide anxiety rather than certainty. The doctor was not arrested, but suspicion had taken root. Later that day, Lydia Ashcombe retreated to her room and refused visitors. Elena, attempting to manage both the household and the growing tension, found herself overwhelmed. Miss Marple sought her out in the afternoon, finding her seated at the desk in the Colonel's study. "You're doing too much," Miss Marple said kindly. Elena looked up with tired eyes. "Someone must." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "though I find it interesting who does, and who does not." Elena hesitated. "What do you mean? The Colonel trusted you with the accounts," Miss Marple said, "yet he entrusted his will to Arthur Bell." Elena's mouth tightened. "Uncle never trusted anyone completely. That," Miss Marple replied, "is often very sensible." Meanwhile, Arthur Bell had become increasingly withdrawn. Inspector Keen discovered that the Colonel had summoned him urgently 2 days before Christmas Eve, an unusual request at such a late hour. He was agitated. Arthur admitted under questioning. Said he'd made a mistake. What sort of mistake? The inspector pressed. Arthur hesitated. A financial one. Miss Marple wondered if that were the whole truth. That evening a new complication arose. The village constable arrived with news. The Colonel's personal safe, concealed behind a panel in the library, had been opened, and was now empty. Inspector Keen examined the panel carefully. No sign of forced entry. Then whoever opened it knew the combination. Elena said quietly. "All of us knew it." Lydia's voice came sharply from the doorway. She had emerged suddenly, her expression tight. Reginald was careless that way. Miss Marple noticed how Lydia's gaze flicked, just for an instant, toward the library desk. The safe, it transpired, had contained personal papers, some cash, and a sealed envelope marked private. Its disappearance sent a ripple of alarm through the household. What was in that envelope? Inspector Keen asked Arthur. Arthur swallowed. A memorandum, instructions to be opened in the event of the Colonel's death. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. And who was meant to open it? Me, Arthur admitted. That night Miss Marple lay awake longer than usual. The manor was restless, doors creaking, footsteps passing, whispers carried faintly through the corridors. It reminded her unpleasantly of an incident years before, when a supposedly grieving household had busied itself rearranging blame before the truth could emerge. The next morning brought yet another disturbance. The housemaid, Elsie, tearful and frightened, confessed to Inspector Keen that she had seen someone in the corridor late on Christmas Eve. "I thought it was Miss Lydia," she said. Same height, same dress colour. Lydia denied it vehemently. I went straight to bed after seeing Reginald settled. Dr. Finch, however, admitted he had also been awake late, reviewing notes in his study. Suspicion shifted, reformed, reattached itself elsewhere. Miss Marple spoke quietly with Elsie afterward. "Are you certain it was Mrs. Ashcombe?" she asked. Elsie shook her head. "Not certain, miss, just similar. Similarity," Miss Marple said gently, "is a dangerous thing." That afternoon Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Pelham at the post office. Did the Colonel receive any unusual letters recently? She asked casually. Mrs. Pelham nodded eagerly. One, just before Christmas. Foreign stamp. He looked quite shaken after reading it. Do you recall the sender? No name, just initials. Miss Marple thanked her and walked back through the snow, her thoughts arranging themselves more rapidly now. A letter from abroad, a safe emptied, a will under revision, a draft that may not have been what it seemed. And then, quite by chance, she noticed something else. In the Colonel's bedroom the clock on the mantel was precisely 15 minutes slow. She mentioned it to Elena. Our uncle insisted on it. Elena said it helped him sleep. Miss Marple smiled faintly, or helped him notice something others might miss, she thought. That evening Inspector Keene announced his intention to summon a specialist toxicologist from the county. Dr. Finch reacted badly. This is unnecessary, he said sharply. You're turning grief into spectacle. Miss Marple watched him go, his shoulders stiff with anger or fear. The red herrings lay thick now, almost too thick. Dr. Finch with access to medicine, Lydia with motive and opportunity, Arthur Bell with secrets, Elena with control of the household, Margaret Bell, nervous, observant, overlooked. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she knitted by the fire. When everyone is suspicious, she reflected, one must ask who is most comfortable with that fact. Outside, the snow began to melt, and with it the false calm that had settled over Hollybrook since Christmas Eve. By the time the snow began to retreat from the hedgerows and drip steadily from the eaves of Greystone Manor, Miss Jane Marple had reached a state of mind she recognized well, the gentle certainty that comes not from sudden insight, but from many small observations finally aligning. She sat in the small sitting-room adjoining her bedroom, a pot of tea cooling beside her, her knitting abandoned for once. Her thoughts moved with quiet precision, returning again and again to a handful of details others had dismissed as trivial. It was almost always the trivial things, she knew, that betrayed the truth. Inspector Keene arrived shortly before noon, summoned by Elena at Miss Marple's polite request. He found Miss Marple by the fire, her expression mild, almost apologetic. "You wished to speak with me, Miss Marple?" "Yes," she said pleasantly. "I hope you'll forgive an old woman's interference, but I believe I understand what happened to Colonel Ashcombe." He raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold statement. So it may seem," Miss Marple agreed, "but not, I think, an inaccurate one. She began not with the death, but with the Colonel's state of mind. He was worried, she said." Mrs. Pelham confirmed as much. He had received a letter from abroad, one that disturbed him deeply. Inspector Keene nodded. "We've not found it. Indeed, because it was removed from the safe." She explained her reasoning carefully. The safe contained personal papers and a sealed memorandum intended for Mr. Bell, yet the envelope was taken before it could be opened. That suggests panic rather than calculation. Keene frowned. "You believe the contents would have implicated someone?" "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that it threatened to change everything." She moved on to the will. "The Colonel was revising it. Mr. Bell admits as much, but revisions take time, and secrecy. I suspect the Colonel had discovered something about his finances, something that made him realize he had been deceived. By whom?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she spoke of the night draft. It was administered without witnesses, prepared by Dr. Finch, delivered by Mrs. Ashcombe. Keene leaned forward. "You suspect the doctor, I suspect." Miss Marple replied that he is guilty of carelessness rather than murder. The sedative bottle found in his waste bin was real, but the additional substance was not his doing. She described the Colonel's clock, set 15 minutes slow. He was a methodical man. That clock was his way of noting something, someone who entered or left at a particular time. And what time was that? Between 10 and half past. Keene exhaled slowly. That narrows it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Only if one already knows where to look. That afternoon Miss Marple asked Elena for permission to review the household accounts once more. Elena agreed readily, relieved to share the burden. It was there, among columns of figures and receipts, that Miss Marple found confirmation. Small withdrawals, regular, just beneath notice, maintenance, Elena had assumed. Uncle rarely explained such things, but Miss Marple recognized the pattern at once. It reminded me of a situation in St. Mary Mead, she said later to Inspector Keene. A trusted relative skimming modest sums over years, nothing dramatic, just enough to feel secure. And the Colonel noticed, yes, and when he did he acted. He wrote to someone abroad, someone who could confirm his suspicions. He revised his will, he drafted a memorandum, and then he made a fatal error. He confronted the wrong person too soon. The revelation came not through accusation, but observation. That evening Miss Marple asked that everyone gather in the drawing-room. Inspector Keene was present, standing unobtrusively near the door. Miss Marple sat, hands folded, her voice calm. "I'm afraid," she began, "that Colonel Ashcombe did not die of natural causes." There was a murmur. "He was poisoned," she continued, not violently, not crudely, but deliberately. Lydia stiffened. Miss Marple turned to her, but not accusingly. "You loved your husband," she said kindly, "in your own way, but you did not kill him." Lydia gasped. "Thank God." Miss Marple inclined her head. "The draught you gave him had been altered, but not by you." She turned next to Dr. Finch. "You prescribed the sedative, but someone else accessed it afterward." "Doctor." Finch looked stricken. Yes, the study was unlocked." Miss Marple nodded. She faced Elena at last. "You managed the accounts. You knew the household routines. You knew when the Colonel slept. And you knew where the safe was." Elena's face drained of colour. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "The Colonel discovered the discrepancies. He wrote abroad to confirm them. He planned to expose the truth, and alter his will accordingly." Arthur Bell inhaled sharply. "You had been diverting funds," Miss Marple said softly, "not out of greed, but fear of losing Greystone, fear of change." Elena shook her head. "I only meant to borrow. And then he confronted you." Miss Marple continued. "You panicked. You altered the draft, just enough to stop his heart quietly. Silence filled the room. The letter, the memorandum, you removed them from the safe." Elena's voice broke. "I didn't mean to kill him." Inspector Keene stepped forward. "That will be for the court to decide." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "It always is." Outside, the church bells rang, not for celebration, but for truth finally spoken. The morning after the revelation dawned crisp and clear, as though Hollybrook itself had been holding its breath until justice had been understood. The snow glistened beneath a pale sun, each branch outlined in frosty white, and the Manor's windows reflected a clarity that Miss Marple found oddly comforting. In the drawing-room the household gathered once more. There was a sense of relief, mingled with lingering tension, but the knowledge that the mystery had been understood, though not without consequence, lent a solemn order to their mourning. Inspector Keene addressed the group first. "Miss Elena Ashcombe has confessed to the administration of a substance in the Colonel's draft, intended to incapacitate him rather than harm. The full circumstances will, of course, be examined by the magistrate, but the truth is now known." Elena, pale but composed, nodded. She spoke in a quiet, measured tone. "I did not intend for him to die. I only wanted time to arrange matters so that Greystone Manor could remain safe without loss to anyone who relied on it. Margaret Bell, who had observed Eleanor's distress throughout, whispered softly to Lydia, "She looks so young to carry such a burden." Lydia patted her hand. "Sometimes one is forced into choices no one can foresee. Doctor," Finch, who had remained silent, now addressed the room, "I should like to apologize for any distress caused by my own negligence in leaving the sedative accessible. It was not intended for harm, but it facilitated one." Arthur Bell, though stern, softened slightly. "The law will deal with details as it must, but Greystone Manor can remain intact, and some order has returned." Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, allowed herself a small smile. The chaos, she reflected, had been layered, subtle, and human, not malicious beyond measure, but human all the same. She rose and spoke. "Sometimes one forgets how delicate balance can be. Greed, fear, and love are all threads in the same cloth. When pulled sharply they unravel, but when handled with patience and understanding, repair is possible." Eleanor's eyes, red, rimmed, met Miss Marple's. You saw it all." "Not all," Miss Marple replied. "Only the threads I needed to see. The rest the Lord will determine, or the magistrate." The villagers, having been summoned to the manor's hall in small groups, were now reassured by Inspector Keen's careful explanation. Gossip, though still present, was tempered by understanding. The mystery that had unsettled them all was solved, though at a personal cost. In the following days the manor resumed a quieter rhythm. Eleanor faced the necessary legal proceedings with grace. Lydia remained supportive, helping wherever possible. Margaret Bell, having witnessed events, kept a careful journal, a habit she promised herself would never leave her again. Dr. Finch took extra precautions in his medical practice, humbled and wiser. Arthur Bell remained the steadfast guardian of Greystone's administration, ensuring that order prevailed where disruption had threatened. Miss Marple, for her part, prepared to leave. Her train awaited. The snow softened to slush in the sunlit lanes. She stood at the manor's gate, glancing back at the house she had come to observe. Eleanor appeared beside her. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said simply, "for everything." "You're welcome, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "Remember this, people are rarely as villainous or as innocent as they seem. Often the truth lies somewhere between, and it is patience and observation that reveal it." The sleigh bells of a passing carriage jingled softly in the distance. The crisp air carried the faint scent of burning pine, of hope, and of Christmas that, in its own quiet way, had survived despite tragedy. Miss Marple stepped onto the path, her sensible shoes crunching in the thawing snow. Behind her, Greystone Manor seemed to breathe again. The tension dissolving into the calm of a world returned to its proper order. Children's laughter drifted faintly from the village, and Mrs. Pelham's post-office door swung in the wind, welcoming another day. As she walked toward the station, she reflected on the human heart, how easily it could be both frail and formidable, how one moment of fear could ripple through a household, and how gentle inquiry, rather than accusation, often uncovered the most stubborn truth. At the station she waited for her train, the whistle sounding in the distance. She looked up at the soft blue sky and allowed herself a small, contented smile. Christmas would come again, as it always did. But she would remember this one, the silent eve and the fatal morning, not with bitterness but with understanding, and that, she thought, was the best one could hope for in life and in mystery. As the train arrived, she stepped aboard, settling into her seat, her knitting once more in her hands. The carriage filled with the scent of coal and the quiet murmur of travellers. Outside, Hollybrook faded gently into the distance, leaving Miss Marple with the comforting certainty that, for now, order and reason had been restored, and that the human heart, complicated, delicate, and ever surprising, had been quietly revealed.